Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. Niigaanwewidam Sinclair. He is the head of the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, where he holds the Faculty of Arts professorship in Indigenous Knowledge and Aesthetics. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. I had a long morning today, so I had to re-record that intro three times, but we're here. How are you? How is it out in Winnipeg?
It's a beautiful day in Winnipeg. I hope some of your listeners know where Winnipeg is. We're smack dab in the center of Turtle Island or North America, and it's a beautiful day here. We typically have like 7 months of winter in where
Hmm.
this is, so it's normally very cold. So when we do get a beautiful day, we don't like to spend too long of it indoors, but here I am talking to you, and very happy to share with you and your listeners some of the visions from what I call the center of the universe.
Did you grow up there or you moved there for to teach?
No, I grew up here. I'm one of those rare cases that I'm a professor at the university, not where I attended because there's two universities in this city that I live in, Winnipeg. I went to the University of Winnipeg, but I teach now at the University of Manitoba. But I'm from a First Nations, or for some of your listeners, would be called a tribal reserve or an Indian reserve. And that reserve is about 45 minutes from where I'm sitting right now at the university. And
Oh, very
so I
cool.
grew up in that community, and I'm very proud. It's called Peguis First Nation, and I was raised there. I was surrounded by my community and my nation, and then I was lucky enough to become a high school teacher for a short while. I was a high school teacher, a drama teacher, an English teacher, also a Indigenous Studies teacher. And then I went on to go back and get my graduate work. And now I work as a professor in Indigenous Studies, but I also do a lot of work in education with school districts all across North America, particularly in Canada. And I work on areas of uh, what we call reconciliation in Canada, which is how do we incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the school system to support not Indigenous students so much as non-Indigenous students to understand the history of Canada, understand the history of the culture of Canada, and that always begins with Indigenous peoples, and also to deal with some of the most pressing issues in the future, which is climate change, affordability, issues around conflict and democracy. It's Indigenous peoples who invented all of those things. And I think that it is only nowadays when Canadians and Americans are realizing that the things they hold most dear are all Indigenous peoples.
Hmm. And so I know that so did you teach on the reserve or did you teach outside of it?
No, I taught in a public school in Winnipeg, and like many Indigenous professionals, I was the first Indigenous teacher at the school that I taught at. That school's now over 120 years old, and
Oh, wow.
I was the first Indigenous teacher when I started working there in the year 2000. And since then, they've had many Indigenous teachers now. In fact, my daughter just graduated from that same school, and she was lucky enough to have four Indigenous teachers that she worked with during her time in that school, which is a massive, huge public school that has over 100 teachers on the faculty.
Hmm. So you talked a little bit about this curriculum development. I think that's something that's fascinating, and I'd like to get a little bit into that. So what are some of the things that you found were originally not really incorporating the Indigenous perspective, and then what have been some of the changes that you've worked to make?
So the easiest way to identify this is to talk about where Indigenous peoples are often talked about the most, which is in areas of social studies and sometimes in literature. Uh, it's well known that in social studies, we have been misrepresented in the history and the stories that have been told about the founding of Canada, the founding of the United States. Indigenous peoples are always the footnotes to history. We are always the stereotypes that are oftentimes what we call othered or classified and created as opposite to settlers and the civilization and Christianity. And so Indigenous peoples are always the evil, horrible problems that settlers have to face in order to become American or, you know, institute things like freedom and democracy and all these kinds of really, frankly, lies that are told to young people and taught to young people like myself. And whether it be in the United States or Canada, those textbooks are remarkably the same. Indigenous peoples are always the sidekicks or problems, much like the Lone Ranger and Tonto, or much like the Dances with Wolves. Indigenous peoples are always inferior and problems that non-Indigenous peoples have to somehow solve. And that's whether it's in Western movies or whatever, or in novels. It is also in textbooks. So social studies is the basic one. So correcting that narrative, talking about what Indigenous peoples are, not what they are not, talking about what Indigenous peoples contribute and have contributed, which are everything that we know of as Canada and the United States were invented by Indigenous peoples. Every single penny on every single paycheck of every single American, every single Canadian comes from Indigenous lands and resources. Every single policy and practice that is known within Canada and the United States, these are all at some point invented by Indigenous peoples or Indigenous peoples had significant contributions to. And so really, social studies should be about teaching all of that. It should be about teaching Canadians what it means to be Canadian, and the first and foremost teaching is what their relationship with Indigenous peoples are. Same thing with Americans. But then there's literature. You know, when oftentimes for a long time, a long period, anyways, there was misrepresentations of Indigenous peoples in literature too. Oftentimes there would be stories, not just by people who fabricated and created stereotypes of Indigenous peoples, but also people who pretended to be Indigenous peoples and would write novels in Indigenous voices. And so literature was oftentimes doing the same work that social studies was doing. And never mind the fact that in virtually all the other subjects, from health to phys ed to math to science to name any subject, and you would be hard pressed to find Indigenous peoples ever mentioned at all, as if Indigenous peoples never had science or math or had ways that we envisioned health or ways that we did physical education. The fact is that Indigenous peoples not only had all of those subjects, but oftentimes did them better than Western science. So, like, for example, Indigenous peoples had radical ways that we built sailing vessels, or that we built ways that we hunted, or the ways that we would imagine the constellations in the sky. So we often learn a great deal about people from Greece and Rome and Europe, but we don't learn about the knowledge that's within the very footsteps or the ground in which we live in. And I think that's a travesty. That actually is creating incompetent citizens. And so no wonder we have a problem with racism. Like, no wonder we have a problem with people who don't understand their relationship with the earth and therefore have no problems creating endless pipelines that destroy it. No wonder we have people that fight and turn to violence instead of working together, because frankly, the problem is that we've created generations upon generations of incompetent Canadians and Americans who don't know how to live in this place appropriately, with kindness and with generosity, and frankly don't really know what it means to be Canadian or American. And that's ultimately the problem that we have, which is what results in all this violence or conflict or environmental disaster that's before us. It ultimately starts with the conversation of what is our relationship with the people who have been here the longest, who have lived here the longest, know the most about this place, and therefore can help us, every single person, on how to live here in a kind and just way.
Hmm. So would you say that primarily the approach is, because I think you brought up something really interesting, and this is something I think about often as well, where when I think about how I learned math, it's unfortunate that we didn't learn the history of math, how so many of these amazing things from Pythagoras' theorem, all these things have been invented and rediscovered all over the world independently many times throughout history. And so it's not actually just Pythagoras who came up with it. And so understanding how kind of every culture has made significant strides in their own understanding of the world can give you this sense of connectedness that I think when you only learn about a few specific philosophers or thinkers or scientists, you kind of get this jaded, not full perspective of the world. So is a lot of the work that you're doing kind of adding these things to math and science and social science and literature, or is it mainly focused just on literature and social science?
No, I work with everything, and I
Mm,
work with every subject, but I'm not an expert, obviously. I'm not a physicist, so I can't do physics equations and uh, indigenous ways that we imagine physics. Like nobody can be an expert on everything, but
hmm
I can tell you that any any system in which one group of racialized people are constantly celebrated as the heroes, and another group of people are celebrated as the losers or the evildoers, or they have nothing useful to contribute. That is a system that we should all be deeply suspicious about.
mm,
Whenever any system purports to be a singular story about one group of people who happen to all look the same, have the same gender, the same race, and that they are the only ones who get to be the gatekeepers of all things that are good, we should be deeply suspicious of that system. And we might be being sold a bill of goods that's completely wrong, completely one sided, and therefore will lead us down the wrong path, will lead us towards more conflict, not more solutions.
mm. One thing that I'm curious about is for the children who grow up in kind of this newer system that you're talking about, I think it offers them the ability or the chance to actually critically think about their relationship to their land, to the people who came here before them, to their ancestors. What are your thoughts on how the process it takes to decolonize the mind for adults, for people who already were taught in a certain way? Is that process different?
I think sometimes when people are taught things for a long time, they think that there is only one way to think and there's only one approach. And I can think of the example of I grew up in the 1980s when I learned how to do math in a particular way. Long division is probably the best example of that. So I learned how to do math in a very specific way of finding the solution, et cetera, et cetera. So my daughter comes home. This is about 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and she is taught a different kind of math that she can get to sometimes the same answer, most oftentimes quicker, but it can she can do math in a different way that challenges her brain in multidimensional ways, not just one way. But I have a real trouble with that. So I really resisted it for a long time because I was used to doing one way and one way of doing patterns and one answer and et cetera, et cetera. Uh, the problem is that there are better ways to do it, and there are more full ways to do it. There are ways that push my brain in stronger and better ways that can make me into a better person, make me a more full person, a more whole person. And that's precisely what I'm talking about. The problem really is that for many people, particularly those who have been taught one way for a long period of time and think that's the only way, they might be very resistant to try more efficient ways or more full ways to become the person, the people that they are, or to reach the answer that they are seeking. Um, and so I think we should all be open. And we might realize that being taught one way is not a human way to learn. All humans learn in
Mm,
different ways, and that we all have our responsibility to come to uh, the party of creation, having brought our perspective, and that's what makes us all uniquely human. If we all said the same thing, then not only would that not be human, we would also be living in such a way in invested in ways that reduce complexity and diversity and make us lesser than as a result, uh, than we would be if we recognize that we all see different perspectives and we can all come to an answer in a fruitful and a good way. And that doesn't mean all answers are correct. That means that we, through reason, dialogue, and conversation, try to figure out what are the ways in which we want to live together.
Hmm. So, in actually implementing some of this curriculum, are there differences that you've already noticed with some of the students?
Oh, this is the most competent generation in history in Canada. Young people today who are graduating, like my daughter, know more about the history of Indigenous peoples, the contributions of Indigenous peoples, and how all of that has gone on to making Canada. Young people today know more than they've ever known before. They still don't know enough. They still have much more to learn. For instance, we still have textbooks that are highly racist and one-dimensional. We still have teachers that don't teach things in their fullest capacity or don't have the amount of knowledge that can help empower young people. And we also have this massive influx of technology into our lives. And so therefore, there's a realization by young people that classrooms might not be the only place that they learn. The problem, of course, is with the internet is that sometimes people spread falsehoods for political purposes. And so we need to teach young people how to not just see all information as good information, but some information needs to be critically analyzed and considered. So we have the most competent generation in history, but we also have a generation that is needing to be more critically aware than ever, more cognizant and more considerate of the information that they're getting at their fingertips, and also from their teachers. So the reality is that I see a generation that's more competent than ever, but I also caution that generation that they are there's going to be forces that will try to manipulate them and to try to control them more than ever, more than my
Hmm.
generation ever had to experience.
And that kind of touches back to the point that you're making earlier of the power of having an education that presents different perspectives. So you train the ability to not just have to take on whatever narrative is presented to you.
Well, yeah. I mean, the reality is that uh, we have to expose young people. Like when we expose young people to the knowledge that makes them who they are, no one's asking them to adopt them as to adopt every single perspective as the only perspective. In fact, that's antithetical to presenting to them multiple perspectives. Our job as educators, as adults, as people who are stepping alongside those we are teaching, our job is to present information in a as balanced and fair way as we can, while also equipping them with the skills necessary to be able to critically analyze that information and make determinations for themselves.
Hmm. Yeah. I think this is a point that I think can be clearly, it's quite obvious, but I think it's still important to ask, which is what are the benefits that whoever is designing the curriculum originally got from having a very like unidirectional kind of approach to teaching these things where there's only one perspective that's given or marginalizing indigenous or other minority population groups? Like what is the benefit of doing something like that for the people
All
who
you
are
have to
building?
do,
Yeah.
go to any government, any cabinet, any any state, any province, any city council, and get a picture of all the people who are in charge. Look to see who it is that are the decision makers. And what you will see is most often they are white men of a certain age group. They are of a particular sexuality, and they are of a particular religious background. That's why it's important. That's why it's been so valuable for people to teach in a unitary direction. Because what it does is it creates privilege for those people who share the same race, religion, sexuality, age group of those in power. And so, no surprise, who are the people in society with the most money? Who are the people with the most amount of power? Who are the people with the most nicest houses? Who are the people who are the law protects? Who are the people that oftentimes never have to worry about having their children taken from them? It's the same people who are in power, the exact same people. And so, whereas the people who have had their land stolen from them, the people who have had their families, their homes, their communities invaded, their children taken away from them, have been hammered into poverty, and then have institutions like police forces and government policies and et cetera, who target them and make sure they stay in poverty. That's situations where when people go into hospitals, they are not afforded the same services as people who are rich and powerful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why you, at the very young ages, tell young people that there's only one group of people that matter. Only one group of people have contributed anything that matters to this country or this uh, continent. And that one group of people, therefore, are the people who we should constantly be voting in as president.
Hmm. So, what do you feel like changed in the last few decades to allow for these curriculum shifts to happen, even though in many ways the same people are still in power?
I think the civil rights movement was a monumental movement across the United States, and the civil rights movement also empowered Indigenous peoples. So when you saw the civil rights movement in the United States, led by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and you saw this emergence of Indigenous civil rights movements too, and Indigenous peoples who began to stand up for their own lands and refuse to acquiesce to being forcibly removed from their territories by government policies, which were random and always targeted towards trying to make Indigenous peoples deficient and lesser than, and in situations of poverty. And so I think the civil rights movement was a big step. And so that's where you eventually get into African Americans who enter into businesses, and then eventually city councils, and then eventually the president's office. That's where you get that. Nowadays, what you do is with other groups, Indigenous peoples in particular, who have picked up some of that work of arguing for rights and refusing to acquiesce and refusing to be treated as second-tier citizens. Eventually, you get into the point in which Indigenous peoples join with other groups, some of them from power brokers who realize that they need to share power, and you get people like Deb Haaland, who is the Secretary of the Interior, the very first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior that we've ever had, who's Indigenous. That's a pretty remarkable step. And I think it's a step that also indicates that change has been happening, but it's been building for decades.
Hmm. So, for you personally, when you were growing up, did you feel a disconnection with whatever it is that you were learning at school from what you may have been taught elsewhere about, who contributed, what did people do, and so on and so forth?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I grew up surrounded by very strong Indigenous peoples, very proud people who always taught me that our peoples, our nations, our culture had really important, valuable things to say. And they would demonstrate that to me through ceremonies, but also political gatherings. And sometimes they would be just stories. Like, the funniest people I ever met in my life were my uncle and my auntie, and people who were just brilliant and smart and did remarkable things. And so I always had a corrective to the stereotypical textbooks that I experienced or the movies that I experienced. I always had something that offset that, because I knew that it wasn't true, because I got to see the reality of the beauty of who Indigenous peoples are. Um, so I got to see those things, and not everybody got to see those things. So especially if you're a British or French student growing up with no contact with Indigenous peoples, all you would see is that textbook. And so no wonder that you were taught, or that you started to believe those things to be true, because there would be no corrective to that. And so my experience growing up was that I was lucky in that I got to see that there is remarkable achievements and contributions, and frankly, completely separate, unique, brilliant contributions or creations or innovations that Indigenous peoples have done and been doing for thousands upon thousands of years in this place that are way better than anything that Europeans brought to this territory. And they might just save us at the end of the day. It might just be that Indigenous peoples, when we reach the end of using all the oil or the gas, or we dig up all the diamonds, or we continue to pollute the air or the waters, it might just be that Indigenous ways are what's going to save us all as human beings. And I
Hmm.
firmly believe that it might just be the people who have been here the longest, who have gone through the biggest struggles, and have therefore thought the most about how to live in this place in a long term. It might just be that those people have really important critical contributions to make to the problems that we're facing today.
Hmm. So when you were in school, do you still remember? Do you feel like that's what inspired you to eventually get into this because you were like, okay, what I experience in my day to day is so different than what I'm being taught in school. Do you feel like that kind of sparked the inspiration for you to then work in this field?
I think part of it was that I always knew something was wrong, and I always knew there was more work to do. But I would tell you that, like, I was like everybody else. Like, I grew up wanting to be a football player. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be someone who would be out there and doing, I don't know, running for office one day. Like, I wanted to do all those things too. It what I realized though is that regardless of what profession that I did, because my first real job was being a teacher. I worked a few other part-time jobs before that, but I worked with in inner city homelessness. I worked at a Pizza Hut pizza joint a long time ago. I realized that whatever job I did, I was constantly being put in the position of talking about Indigenous peoples in that job. I was constantly, because there was so much thirst and interest in my experience, in what I was thinking or what Indigenous peoples were experiencing in that industry, that I started to realize that no matter what job I did, I was always going to be an advocate. I was always going to be somebody who would explain to people uh, what Indigenous perspectives and experiences are. So it really didn't matter what job I did. Uh, Nowadays, though, I think because I not just am a professor, but I write for the local newspaper here in our province called the Winnipeg Free Press, and I just have a platform that's way bigger now than speaking at the coffee break at the pizza joint.
Hmm. Yeah, you have the platform in the media. So when I was doing a little bit of research on some of the things that you did and you know where you come from, I wanted to explore this term a little bit more. I'm a little unaware. And so it's Anishinaabe. Is that pronounced correctly?
Yeah, Anishinaabe is my people. That's the name of our people. We're also known as Ojibwe or Chippewa people, but Anishinaabe is the word that we use to describe ourselves. So that's what's called the
Mm,
endonymic ethnonym, meaning that what a people use to describe themselves, it would be similar to, uh, like, let's say, for example, people calling the British the Redcoats,
mm,
or um, uh, Americans being called some terrible name by, let's say, the Germans during World War II. It's what a people use to describe themselves.
mm,
And that's what Anishinaabe is. And the word Anishinaabe means the spontaneous people, or the people that are moving, the people that are good people. And so not to say anyone else isn't good. Anishinaabe just means that a people who are self-directing, or people who are motivated to change.
mm. And so what are some of the biggest differences between the people of Anishinaabe versus a nearby group of peoples?
Well, I mean, all Indigenous peoples have their own traditions, their own cultures, their own histories, and we're all different in some way to each other. Sometimes, though, we may share linguistic backgrounds, like the ways that English and French have come from the same tree of language. So that one might be, for example, the Algonquin people, the Potawatomi people, or the Odawa people, and the Ojibwe people. All of them would use different forms of Anishinaabe to describe themselves. And so they just might sound a little different, depending on our geography and our history and our accents. And then at the same time, we are completely different than some nations because we have absolutely different and no language connections with them or cultural connections with them all. Those are people like, for example, the Haudenosaunee people or people from the Six Nations or Mohawk people, or Seneca people or Oneida people or Navajo people or Inuit people. Like these are all different nations of Indigenous peoples. And so Anishinaabe is one of those many nations. We're one of the biggest ones, though, but we are one of many, many nations of Indigenous peoples all across Turtle Island or North America.
Hmm. I guess like I'm really fascinated to just learn more about, different. Okay, first of all, I'm just going to ask you a question because I do want to learn how to be politically correct about this. Is it right to say to call it a tribe or no? Do you say like different tribes or what is like the correct way to kind of go about that?
Yeah. Well, first off, it isn't about being politically correct. It's just about being correct.
Yeah.
So, uh, a tribal nation is an independent entity of amongst many tribes. So, for example, tribes can be specific within a group of other tribes, but they might be the same people. So they might be the same nation. So, for
Hmm.
example, the White Earth tribe or the Turtle Mountain tribe, those are independent groups of indigenous peoples that would be part of the Anishinaabe nation. But these are,
Hmm.
the word tribe is used in the United States. We don't actually use that term up here in Canada very much. You'll see that though in the United States, the word tribe.
So people normally call themselves as part of a nation or as part of peoples, but they don't use the word tribe in Canada.
Yeah, that's right. We often call
Okay.
ourselves First Nations here in Canada.
And First Nation and how many nations, different nations are there?
In Canada, there's about 640 First Nations. Then there's several dozen what we call Métis communities or Métis settlements. And then there are several dozen Inuit communities as well. And those are all kind of on par with each other as different nations, oftentimes, sometimes related, but oftentimes independent of one another.
Okay. And are the differences between two different na how would I say this? The differences between two different nations and First Nations, is that how you'd say it? The
Um,
differences between two groups of people in the First Nations.
yeah, like there's, sorry, I'm just trying to move out of my vehicle for a second here. Um, like Indigenous nations are often inherently different to each other, but there are lots of Indigenous nations that share relationality. So they might be, for example, at one time one nation that was split up into several. Because of government policy, they split them up, put one group over here, one group over here. So that those First Nations might see themselves as interconnected, but there are also other Indigenous nations that don't see themselves as interconnected at all and see themselves as quite different.
Hmm. And so when we use words like indigenous, I feel like it's such a large umbrella term. What would you say are some of the common similarities either in culture or in beliefs that kind of unite the different groups?
I think every Indigenous nation has a commitment to land, a commitment to uh, commitment oftentimes to space, and sometimes those connections are very intricately tied to one another. So, like for example, many Indigenous nations will have um, deep historical ties with another one to the point where they're almost indivisible. Like for example, Cree people in where I come from have such a deep linguistic tie to Anishinaabe people that their words that they use are oftentimes the same.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas some indigenous nations that are right next door to each other have absolutely separate histories. They might even had warred with at one time with each other. And so there's Indigenous nations from all across that have all these different stories and histories, but they're all unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the beauty of kind of even as I've been speaking to more and more professors from Australia and New Zealand and the US and in Canada, it's fascinating to see how even though sometimes we can kind of use this indigenous term as like a blanket statement, there is so much diversity that exists. And each First Nations, I hope I still need to figure out how to grammatically use it correctly because each nation has its own culture and practices and you can explore each one infinitely. It's not just like one kind of okay, indigenous to everything, you know?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And the reality is that you could spend your whole life just studying one of the thousands of nations that exist.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I want to say thank you so much for joining today and sharing your insights and wisdom. I mean, I'm very curious to keep up and learn more about the curriculum changes that you're making because I think it's really exciting I hope that eventually also joins the US kind of transformation in how they teach social sciences and history.
Well, yeah. Well, Miigwech, so much for having me. We are constantly sort of reinventing ourselves as Anishinaabe people, and whether it be hundreds of years ago in lodges or teepees, we were fighting against the winter, we're fighting against the mosquitoes, and nowadays we fight against things like the internet or disinformation on the internet or the reality of what it's like to live in a world with climate change. So we're constantly innovating, and yet we're constantly, as Indigenous peoples, reinventing ourselves in the context to maintain our integrity as who we are.
Hmm. I mean, I guess one last question I'd have for you is if you were to recommend any literature or poetry by um, Anishinaabe people, would you have any suggestions?
So if you're in the United States, I would recommend Louise Erdrich is great. Kim Blazer is great. Gerald Visner is great. Hyde Erdrich is great. These are really wonderful writers who have done really remarkable things. And there's many, many others. My colleague Jill Dorfler at the University of Minnesota does really great stuff. Heidi Stark from Turtle Mountain. She's great. And there's many, many others. And I could just keep naming them all off. On the Canadian side, there are some really wonderful writers who are Anishinaabe from my nation as well. Those are people like Leanne Simpson, um, people like there's so many like there's a really great fiction writer named Wabakishik Rice. There's also some wonderful poets, people like Duke Redbird, people who have written really remarkable autobiographies. There's the premier of our province, who's become a politician. His name is Wabanakwit Canoe or Wab Canoe. He wrote a life story about himself. There's just there's a really great poet if you wanted to who's also a two-spirit writer. That's a queer two-spirit LGBTQ writer, Josh Whitehead, who is Cree but comes from my nation, Peguis First Nation, and he is just outstanding, incredible writer. And so I encourage you to check that out as well. And there's hundreds of others that I could come up with. I encourage people to read. I just have a book that just came out. It's called Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Center. It's available at a bookseller named McClelland and Stewart or Penguin Random House Canada. And so it's available now, and it's a story about where I come from and all the different things that are happening in this place that engage Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships or Canadian relationships in this space.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I wrote all of those down. I'll try to throw that all on the bio if anyone wants to check out any of these authors or
There's
poets.
That's the cover right there. So of my
Oh,
book.
great. Great. Okay, cool. Visions of Canada from got it. Cool. I will add that to the bio. But yeah, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, and good luck with the podcast. I do a podcast myself, and it's a labor of love.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.